Orienting yourself to threat could end up perpetuating or worsening the threat.
Mhm.
Because in a sense, you're never looking at the conditions for freedom. You're not creating an appealing version of liberalism that voters will choose over the protest candidates or the fascists. You're never going to beat the conservatives of fear as liberals of fear. I think, like, a liberalism's main problem since the middle of the 20th century is that it doesn't promise a lot. At most, it says, we will keep you safe from harm. But that's not what people are alive for, is mere safety.
The right seems to be better at painting a theoretical threat than we are at saying we'll protect you from it, whether it be like the migrant scare or transing the children or whatever it might be. And then on things like individual freedom and stuff, well, I just don't think we're ever going to out Republicans who have like a monopoly on that. So to me, it just seems like we're creating a losing battle for ourselves in that way.
No, that's a brilliant point, which, you know, I should make myself more often. I should credit you.
What do you see as maybe the original commitments of liberalism before that? Like what were kind of the core focuses, and what did they see as the connections between these things?
The people who did call themselves liberals first in the 19th century were all over the map, like we all are. But I think some of their leaders, and I'm thinking of people like John Stuart Mill and Alexis de Tocqueville, they had a distinctive set of commitments. And they're basically, the idea was definitely freedom, which all liberals have to believe in some way. But it wasn't freedom from, and especially not freedom from the state. Rather, it was like a kind of what we could call creative freedom of self-development, almost artistic, which meant you could do it on your own or do it with others. You might need the state to help you, definitely to liberate you, to be, you know, have the chance for that freedom. And so some of them, let's say, moved in a socialist direction, like Mill died a Bernie bro to all intents and purposes. So those were the original commitments, and I think a lot changed in the 20th century.
And so what do you think were, like I said, the motivations kind of behind the transformation, both just in itself, were they, kind of trying to escape the communism that was on the rise? Was, does big money play a part in this story? And then also, what about the Cold War era specifically kind of gave rise to the environment that allowed this to happen?
Well, I think there are some legitimate reasons for what they did. They did live in the era of the collapse of liberal democracy. They didn't maybe think hard enough about why that had happened, which was like unregulated capitalism led to the Great Depression, which led to the election of Adolf Hitler and the popularity of the communism really across the world. But they were on firm ground and warning about what the real threats to freedom were. I think what they neglected is that in prioritizing the state as the enemy, even though most of them were kind of social democrats, they were very close to a neoliberal rhetoric. But the Cold War liberals, I think, um, they did think that they needed to guard against the simple-minded who might vote with their feet in favor of communism. I think they kind of let communism claim to be emancipatory, and instead of saying it's actually just oppressive and liberalism is the real emancipatory force, they kind of let the communists have that rhetoric. And I worry in my book that they, in the process, gave up a promise of a bright future that liberals could bring about, in favor of this more like cautious and threat, kind of threat matrix type approach.
And there's a bit of a pattern there, I feel like, where, and, it's reducing it down a bit, but you see, liberals giving way to this, and then, Reaganism coming to rise, and then neoliberals giving way to this, and then Bush coming to power, and then neoliberals giving way to this, and then Trump. Could you kind of like detail that, as it seems like a pretty fatal flaw to the philosophy, yet it continuously gets repeated in these cycles?
Yes. Well, it's a fascinating thing because I'm obviously against it, and I agree with you that looking at that history, it seems as if we're forced to see that like orienting yourself to threat could end up perpetuating or worsening the threat.
Mhm.
Because in a sense, you're never looking at the conditions for freedom. You're not creating an appealing version of liberalism that voters will choose over the protest candidates or the fascists or, whomever you think is uh, like however you want to characterize Donald Trump. And um, I think like a liberalism's main problem since the middle of the 20th century is that it doesn't promise a lot. At most, it says, we will keep you safe from harm.
Mhm.
But that's not what people are alive for, is mere safety. Now, these Cold War liberals and their successors who are really still in charge of liberalism, the Atlantic magazine and the New Republic magazine again, and all of these like the New Yorker, like the main outposts of official liberalism, they all have this view. Um, and they will say, no, look, the threats are real, and our first job is at least to keep people from being treated cruelly. Like Judith Shklar, one of the other Cold War liberals, says the point of liberalism is to be about fear and managing it so that we don't have too much to be afraid of. And clearly, the right is scary. But the question is, how did it become that way? And how do you get out of a situation where the right not only keeps winning, but getting worse and more oppressive?
Yeah, and it's because to me it feels like we're creating like an arena for this battle that is always uphill or losing
Yeah.
for us because
Yeah.
we're running away from economic populism, which just makes it harder for us to win over working class voters. And then and how you said, like we'll protect you from a threat is kind of the main thing. The right seems to be better at painting a theoretical threat than we are at saying we'll protect you
Yeah.
from it, whether it be like the migrant scare or transing the children or whatever it might be.
Absolutely.
And then on things like individual freedom and stuff, well, I just don't think we're ever going to out Republicans who have like a monopoly on that. So to me, it just
Good.
seems like we're creating a losing battle for ourselves in that way.
No, that's a brilliant point, which, I should make myself more often. I should credit you. You're never gonna beat the conservatives of fear
Yeah.
as liberals of fear. So, um, and you're right that there is like a lot of success that we've seen in scapegoating, uh, the wrong people for real problems,
Mhm.
ones that liberals help create when they embrace neoliberal policies and liberal interventionism that was a kind of smokescreen for militarism.
Yeah.
And yeah, the conservatives, while not giving up those things either, Donald Trump, like, what's his big achievement? Well, cutting taxes and a belligerent war on Iran in his second term. And yeah, he wins elections by saying, I will, take care of the working class, which was abandoned by the Democrats, which it was.
Yeah.
So I don't really see how the liberals can't kind of return to, in a sense, like a better model. Now, that's not to say these earlier liberals had all the answers and they were flawed in many ways, but they had better answers that seem like they're more like winning strategies and more kind of philosophically appealing for our time.
Yeah, and before I get to my last question, the last point kind of on what you were saying about Trump that I had was I think COVID is like a really good example of that. Like Trump really fumbled COVID and on
Yeah,
all facets, both in terms
yeah,
of handling it and then the economic front, we saw unemployment go up. And then Biden, for all his faults, did lead the strongest recovery to COVID of any
yeah,
country in the world. Yet it was like a weakness for him, and Trump just going 9% Biden inflation became like a major strength for him. So just in that, it's like had we had a
totally.
focus on economic populism rather than just doing Trump bad, maybe there would have been different angles.
I love that, and the success of the affordability agenda in with Zoran Mamdani's candidacy suggests that there could be like national victories You
Yeah.
know, I don't want to get into like, are the DSAs liberals without using that word? I mean, I would stress that liberals invented socialism, and liberal socialism, as in Mill's example, is a thing.
Yeah.
And which word we use, liberal or socialist, is immaterial. The question is, what's the program, and is it about this kind of emancipatory freedom and fairness that liberals began to offer? Socialists pitched in, they were in dialogue, they were the same people, and we ought to be too.
Yeah, yeah, the two aren't really antithetical to each other, especially with how many of like the, I guess, without getting too much into it, like the DSA candidates, they're really just economic populists. Like that's kind of what's winning people
Totally.
over for the most part. Maybe some
Yeah.
more so or less so than
Yeah.
others.
Bernie Sanders was like, just, could we have some Denmark here? And they're
Exactly.
not commies in Denmark.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Like, can we just give everyone health care? It's so radical. But
yeah.
yeah, on the last question is just liberalism, obviously in this state of needing a fix, the $1 million question, what are the steps to kind of fix it and rebuild back this credibility for the left with liberalism? Is it kind of, as you mentioned a couple of times, dipping back into those New Deal era, before the Cold War liberals
Yeah.
kind of switch things? Is it fundamentally transforming it to something new? How do we kind of fix that?
Well, I think at the kind of philosophical or spiritual level, there are these commitments that are abstract but all important, like saying that liberalism is about a new way of life that's promising a bright future and more kinds of freedom for more people. And it's not like freedom from atrocity or the state's interference with you. Um, I do think like the $1 million question is, what should liberals say about the contemporary political economy? Because I get going back to Franklin Roosevelt, if we're going to say, the only thing to fear is fear itself, including a liberalism of fear.
Mhm.
But we're not living in, a Fordist economy where most people work in factories. Um, and so what it would mean to have a New Deal has to be very different, especially after neoliberal globalization, when the targets of regulation are multinational corporations and mobile, like wealthy folks who are offshoring assets. And I mean, I'm for higher taxes and wealth taxes and all of that, but it's not like we can't ignore that the liberals have to have a new theory of like, how do you broaden opportunity in our kind of economy, which I think no one's come up with yet or really is even focusing on. So in that sense, it will have to be radically new, but it can breathe some of the spirit of the original OG liberalism and reject the mistakes of the past century.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's a lot of what I think people don't factor in is like the coalition building needed for that is a lot different. Like a lot of people say,
Yes.
obviously, like it was a New Deal for white people, kind of, as a
And
way
white males, I mean,
exactly to get that coalition where now there's different focuses. It's more multiracial. So it's like harder to
completely.
get what you need behind that.